Thank you so much for joining. This is a briefing that is being organised by the High Seas Alliance. The purpose is just to really explain what's happened with the High Seas Treaty, because it's an extraordinarily significant moment for the ocean, and it's something that's going to continue to be present in all our lives for some considerable time. So I thought it might be useful early doors to just give you a little bit of a briefing about that. And also it's an opportunity to just clarify a few areas which are causing some confusion. So I have a group of people who are going to explain it in as simple and swift terms as possible, because we can always go into more detail in writing later, and there will be notes coming out after this webinar. You'll be hearing from Natalie Ray. Natalie's with the High Seas Alliance, from Nicola with the Pew Charitable Trusts, Lisa with the Natural Resources Defence Council, Daniel, who's with the High Seas Alliance, Duncan with the High Seas Alliance and the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, and Rebecca, who's the new director of the HSA, the Alliance. And I'm going to start by handing over to Natalie. And just to let you know, you can drop questions into the chat, but also ask questions at the end, but we prefer that you waited until then. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, thanks, Mirella, and thanks everybody for joining. It's a pleasure to talk to you today a bit more about this historic ocean win for the planet. So the ocean is finally in the room. On the 4th of March, this last Saturday, in the sort of later hours of Saturday, after almost non-stop negotiation for almost 2 days, the world's governments finalized a new UN treaty for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. That's BBNJ for short, or basically to protect high seas marine life. So this new treaty basically addresses many of the governance gaps that have plagued the ocean for many years, and it sets out much clearer ways on how to conserve biodiversity on the high seas. Basically, it sets up a new framework that will be able to establish high seas marine protected areas, and it gives also a pathway to establishing a pathway to achieving the 30 by 30 goal, which is to establish at least 30% marine protection by 2030. So this framework didn't previously exist for MPAs. So now that enables, there are clearer rules and processes on how to establish these high seas marine protected areas. Because until now, it was just just a number of areas on the ocean where it was possible, such as in the Antarctic and the Northeast Atlantic. It also agreed some provisions on other key elements, including the fair sharing of benefits that come from marine genetic resources, also the processes on how to conduct environmental impact assessments on the high seas. It lays out clearer about capacity building provisions and also technology transfer, and my colleagues are going to go into more details about that later on. It also makes a much clearer link of the treaty with existing bodies. So ocean governance has been this patchwork of different authorities on the high seas with many gaps and no clear mechanism on how to coordinate and cooperate together. And now this treaty has established this conference of parties. It's a mechanism of how, like a platform on how these different bodies can work together and coordinate for the benefit of the high seas and its marine biodiversity. And also, it's established other key institutional frameworks, such as a scientific and technical body, and also committees to monitor implementation and compliance. And one of the key wins as well from this treaty is that it can vote. So we've seen in other fora that they've really been hampered by the consensus decision making, and now this treaty goes beyond really bringing ocean governance into the 21st century in the allowing voting to happen on key decisions around agreeing on MPAs or marine protected areas or on marine genetic resources. And this is going to be absolutely critical, ensuring the effectiveness of the treaty going forward. So that is a kind of, in a nutshell, how great this new treaty is in terms of what new it brings, and now we're going to go into much more detail in terms of the key elements around that. And that's, I think, I'm going to hand over to Nicola.
Thanks very much, Natalie. So for starting off with the area-based management tool chapter, there are 5 key things that I want to highlight in terms of what exactly this new treaty provides with regards to marine protected areas, which, as I'm sure most of you know, are some of the most powerful tools that we have for combating biodiversity loss and maintaining healthy, functioning ocean ecosystems. So first, critically, the agreement creates a new body, and it empowers that new body to establish marine protected areas in the high seas, which is huge. It also empowers that new body to consider a management plan for those marine protected areas, as well as associated measures that would underpin the MPA. And so those are 2 components that we need to ensure that these future high seas MPAs are effective. And not only does the agreement empower this new body to establish MPAs and measures, it also actually sets that as a goal of the agreement to establish a connected network of high seas MPAs. And I do want to clarify, there's been some confusion in some of the news stories. This new agreement does not directly protect 30% of the high seas, but what it does do is it provides us a pathway to achieve this goal of protecting 30% of the high seas by enabling the global community to establish marine protected areas in these high seas areas. A second exciting thing that this treaty does, it allows for marine protected areas to be adopted by a vote when consensus cannot be reached. And this prevents any single nation from having a veto on the establishment of these important conservation places. Third, the marine protected area definition confirms that MPAs should have a conservation objective, and it further confirms that any sustainable use activities that happen within an MPA should only happen as appropriate and only as long as they are consistent with the conservation objectives. Fourth, this new agreement establishes a goal that the agreement itself should support developing countries through capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, so that they are better empowered to develop, implement, monitor, and manage future high seas MPAs. And the 5th and final takeaway from the new text that I want to share is that it empowers the new body to take action in emergency situations, so that we can respond more swiftly to natural and human-caused disasters. All right, next slide. So how will these future high seas MPAs be set up exactly? How will the process work? So the new agreement text outlines a process, and I won't go over all of the details because we're short on time, but I'll give a super high level overview of how it will work. So first, a state or a group of states will submit a proposal for a marine protected area. And the agreement sets out key information that has to be included as part of that proposal, including, of course, the identification of the area to be protected, what threats it faces, what the objectives would be, as well as a draft management plan and proposed management measures. The proposal would then undergo a consultation process where stakeholders would have the opportunity to review and comment on the proposal. And then the proponent would then consider the input received during the consultation process and may revise the proposal as appropriate or just respond to the comments. And then the next step, the scientific and technical body would review and assess the MPA proposal and provide its recommendation to the decision-making body. And then the final step, the decision-making body would decide whether or not to establish the MPA. So the text also does provide guidelines for implementation, monitoring, and review of the MPAs established as well. Now, moving on to some questions that we've been getting a lot. What about existing activities like fishing and mining, et cetera? So, I mean, again, as many of you know, many human activities, including fishing, potential future mining, and shipping, are all managed by other sectoral organizations. And we should be clear that this BBNJ agreement cannot tell those other bodies what to do. However, what it can do is it can provide a space and a platform for these different sectoral organizations to all come together to think about these places from a cross-sectoral and cumulative perspective, and hopefully to adopt a coordinated and coherent approach to the management of these important places. And we can talk more about this question later on in the Q&A if folks are interested. Otherwise, I will hand it over to, I think, Lisa.
Hello, everyone, and good morning. As Nicholas said, marine protected areas are among the most powerful tools we have to enhance ocean resilience in the face of climate change. So the MPA ABMT section of the agreement is very important. The environmental impact assessment part of the agreement addresses the rest of the ocean, the areas outside of fully protected areas that will need to be managed appropriately at moving forward. And this agreement goes far towards strengthening the assessment and management of human activities outside protected areas. And it does so in 5 principal ways. First, it establishes basic modern requirements for assessing and managing planned human activities outside of protected areas. So new activities on the high seas, such as geoengineering proposals, high seas aquaculture, floating energy installations, etc., will be subject to detailed public notice, consultation, comment provisions, and will be required to be managed to avoid, mitigate, or prevent significant adverse impacts. With respect to existing activities, as Nicola said, the new agreement and the Conference of the Parties established under it cannot tell existing bodies like RFMOs or ISA what to do. But over time, the modern assessment and management requirements in this agreement will help reform and strengthen the management of fishing, mining, shipping, and other activities that have contributed to the overall decline in ocean health and resilience. And they'll do that by establishing globally agreed norms requiring that all activities are managed to avoid, mitigate, or prevent significant adverse impacts. Although I would just note that, of course, many of our High Seas Alliance organizations oppose seabed mining altogether. But Duncan Curry will address the relationship with seabed mining and this treaty. The fourth big piece is the treaty provides for much greater transparency when an activity is conducted within national jurisdiction. For example, offshore oil and gas developments, pollutant discharges, etc., could have effects in areas beyond national jurisdiction. That will allow the global community to at least be aware of potential impacts on the high seas of activities conducted within national jurisdiction. And finally, the treaty will bring accountability and science into decision-making through a variety of provisions, and overall will provide a greater say to the international community as a whole in the management of human activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So the environmental impact assessment provisions of the treaty are very important and will, we believe, really help strengthen and modernize how we manage fishery, a variety of different human activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And next up, I believe, is Duncan Curry.
It's Daniel next. Go for it, Daniel.
Okay, so before we go into what the text says about marine genetic resources, maybe just a very brief primer of what they are. So MGRs are the genetic material of any plant, animal, or microbe, and both those as well as their digital version, so-called digital sequence information, as well as derivatives, so biochemical products, are all covered in the agreement, and they have attracted substantial interest from science and industry, for example, to develop new drugs or cosmetics. This was not known when UNCLOS was negotiated, so activities with regards to MGRs in areas beyond national jurisdiction are currently not regulated. At the same time, the capability to undertake research and development and harness the benefits from these resources is unequally distributed, and the BBNJ agreement seeks to address both of these facts. So what was agreed? At its heart, the section that deals with MGRs, part 2, aims to balance the freedom of marine scientific research with fair and equitable sharing of benefits. It contains obligations for states to share both non-monetary benefits, for example, access to samples and increased scientific cooperation, as well as monetary benefits for both MGRs and digital sequence information. The monetary benefit sharing will initially take the form of an annual payment by developed states that is calculated on the basis of their other contributions. But the COP can adopt alternative modalities in the future, for example, a payment directly linked to the value of sales of products. It also establishes a notification system to inform and monitor the implementation of these obligations, and an access and benefit sharing committee to provide recommendations on how to develop that system into the future. In essence, parties are required to submit notifications on activities with respect to MGRs, both before and after a vessel departs, as well as when these resources are later used to what is called the clearinghouse mechanism, one of the subsidiary bodies established under the agreement. And that one will create a special tag for all of these information that accompanies it along the chain of custody to ensure transparency and monitoring. Next slide, please. In terms of benefits for developing countries, all of these non-monetary and monetary benefits are shared with the objective to improve the capacity of parties, in particular developing state parties, for the conservation and sustainable use of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the monetary benefits that we mentioned earlier from the MGR section will provide a predictable upfront funding from the get-go to support capacity building projects and assist developing states with the implementation. And now it's over to Duncan Curry.
Thank you, Daniel. Just to outline another really important part of the agreement, which was particularly important to developing countries, which is capacity building and marine technology transfer. And these provisions provide funding for primarily, I think, and importantly, for the both participation in the agreement and the implementation by developing countries. You know, they would help cooperation, help them develop their own marine science and technical capability, ensure access to technology on fair terms, things like monitoring, rather sharing of data, sharing of research facilities and collaboration and access to these facilities, access to vessels, institutional capacity, improving their own national regulatory frameworks for compliance and implementation of the agreement, and tools for monitoring and compliance. And then there is a committee set up to oversee all of this. So this was a very hard fought and very important part of the treaty. And the next slide will talk about the funding mechanisms. One of the important and hard fought aspects of the agreement was the mechanism for funding particularly through what are called national contributions. And by that you simply mean the parties set the budget for the BBNJ agreement, which we don't know yet, but it'll be very significant. The European Union have made that very clear, and already there have been some pledges of money towards implementation and so on. And there's a voluntary trust fund, plus there's a special fund funded through the marine genetic resources and the monetary benefit sharing that Daniel outlined, which included the flat fee I just talked about, which means in simple terms, if a country is a party to the agreement, then they be contributing X%, 1, 2, 3, 4%, whatever of the overall budget. And then further down the line, once monetary benefit sharing, such as royalties, milestone payments, any other form of monetary payments, would also go into the special fund, together with contributions from private enterprise, donors, philanthropists, and the GEF, Global Environment Facilities. And again, they've established a finance committee on financial resources to oversee and implement this. Thanks. And here just a few words, because there have been a fair number of questions asked about the relationship of the treaty with deep sea mining. Firstly, just to emphasize, the new treaty will not set rules and regulations for mining at sea, nor will by itself stop deep sea mining from starting in the ocean. And some of you may well know there's a move to give the green light to deep sea mining as early as July of this year. But it does cover, in general terms, and you've heard from Natalie, conservation of marine biodiversity, including marine genetic resources on the seabed. And this has a number of implications, including that the BBNJ agreement is the later agreement in time. It does cover particularly marine biodiversity. So it'll have competence. It's the place that countries look to for marine biodiversity. As Nicholas said, it set up a number of, and Natalie said, it set up a number of institutional mechanisms, importantly the COP, but also the scientific technical body and mechanisms for cooperation. So all of this means that there are more places that you can come to bring problems and to resolve them through diplomacy. And importantly, it does contain obligations and procedures parties need to follow once the treaty comes into force, which I'll outline in the next slide. So a number of specific provisions are, and they mainly turn around cooperation, but these are important. That firstly, parties are required to promote the treaty objectives when participating in bodies such as the International Seabed Authority, as well as fisheries management organizations, for example. And so they are required to, well, yes, it says here the ISA is required. That's not quite correct, but the ISA mechanisms are put into place for the ISA to cooperate with the High Seas Treaty. As Natalie said earlier on, the High Seas Treaty cannot require anything of bodies, but there's a obligation for both for the parties to carry out the obligations of the High Seas Treaty within those bodies and mechanisms for cooperation. And also, quite specifically, parties also need to ensure that the Seabed Authority will follow the environmental impact assessments laid out in the treaty. That's important because there is actually an exception, unfortunately, I'd have to say, in the agreement for certain circumstances when bodies have regulations or standards for environmental assessments. But the Seabed Authority doesn't have those, even for exploration activities. It only has non-binding guidelines, and it has yet to develop the exploitation code. And so I think that one of the real implications of this treaty is that the parties, again, as I said before, the parties to the ISA, to the BBNJ, who are also parties to the ISA, which is, you know, the majority really, need to ensure that the ISA provisions that are developed are consistent with the BBNJ requirements for environmental impact assessments. Also, there are provisions for transparency. For example, you know, some of the questions we had is what are the circumstances with MPAs that also cover or threatened potentially by deep sea mining. And I think the important thing to remember there is, again, parties have to promote the adoption of relevant measures within the Seabed Authority and ensure their activities are conducted consistently with the High Seas Treaty decisions. So, and as Lisa said, importantly, you know, one party cannot control the activities, or rather one body cannot control the activities of the other body, but the players in those bodies are states parties. And so what we have now under the agreement is an obligation of those states parties to act consistently in the various agreements. Thanks. And over to you.
Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks, Marilla. So next steps, which is really where it gets exciting. The first and most important and urgent thing to do is for all parties to the UN to adopt the treaty text. In New York, they worked for 2 weeks and then through the night, as Natalie said, for almost 2 days to agree the text. So this is really a formality, but it needs to be done. The lawyers will first scrub the text and then it'll be translated into the official UN languages, and that can be adopted by the parties. Step 2 is ratification, and this is essentially when nations formally consent to the new international law and ensure that their national laws are consistent with the treaty. It's in the treaty that we need 60 countries to ratify the treaty for it to come into force, and the High Seas Alliance is really going to be looking to the High Ambition Coalition of 52 nations to take the lead with ratification and ensure that we can bring it into force as soon as possible. And we believe that a realistic and appropriate deadline or goal for that is by the next United Nations Ocean Conference in 2025 in Nice, France, which France is already signalling is a good ambition. Next, we really need to work on implementation. And so a few people have mentioned this. The High Seas Treaty will fill a huge hole in our ability to govern and protect biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, but it will require some important institutional arrangements that need to be set up. Quite a few, including the scientific and technical body, the Conference of Parties, finance and compliance committees, funds for finance, and more. And lastly, but absolutely not least, the high seas supports an incredible abundance of marine life and biodiversity, which is why we're all here. And it provides migratory routes for whales and sharks and other species, and harbours remarkable ecosystems, but only 1% are currently protected, as Natalie mentioned. So we really need to get started on fixing this as soon as possible. And whilst ratification and implementation get underway, new high seas MPAs can be investigated and proposals developed so that they're ready for the first COP to be voted on. So the High Seas Alliance has already identified 8 areas that could make up the first generation of MPAs, including Emperor Seamounts, Sargasso Sea, and Salas y Gomez and Nazca Ridges. And we'll be looking very much forward to this part of the next steps, where the rubber hits the ground, as we say. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. So thank you, everyone. I am going to take questions. Just a couple of means through which you can stay up to date with this, because obviously, you know, we recognise it is quite complicated and will continue to be, but also, you know, as others have said, it's actually tremendously exciting. And, you know, personally, I'm really looking forward to the first conference of the parties, because it'll be the first time that the oceans had that. So ways you can keep up to date: we'll be starting up a newsletter. We are producing some briefing notes and FAQs about what we've been talking about today. Those will be available on the High Seas Alliance website, and of course you can follow us on Twitter to stay up to date. Thank you. I've got a question. Who is going to be in charge of control and surveillance? What prospect is there of real control, sanctions for those who violate the treaty, and who will do it? Who's going to take that one? That's a Duncan. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Marilla. It's a really good question. This issue was really hard fought and went right down to the line, even on the last day. But essentially, the building blocks are in place. That's one of the exciting things about this treaty, is that it really has set up some effective mechanisms. The first is something that we've promoted for a long time, which is an implementation and compliance committee. And this is a committee which is common to many multilateral organizations. It's sort of following the Paris Agreement model. It is transparent, so it relies a lot on transparency, but also non-adversarial and non-punitive. So we're dealing with diplomacy here, and so the idea is that when there are issues that arise, then they can be brought to the attention of the Implementation and Compliance Committee, which would then make a recommendation to the Conference of the Parties, usually, and try to solve it. Again, this is something we've seen in other organizations that does work well. If that doesn't solve the problem, there are dispute settlement provisions, such as an overall obligation to settle disputes by peaceful means, and then the specific provision which I think could be quite useful, which is solve disputes of a technical nature. And what that means is there's an expert panel established by the Conference of the Parties to resolve the dispute without going to dispute settlement. But then at the end of the day, if even that doesn't resolve the problem, then there is a very specific provision for the settlement of disputes, as well as an ability to ask the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which is an international court based in Hamburg, Germany, for what's called an advisory opinion. So there are a number of steps that can be taken, and the last thing I would say is that during the course of this presentation, we've outlined a number of committees, such as the Access and Benefit Sharing Committee that Daniel talked about, that would have a specific competence to address these sorts of compliance and technical issues relating to marine genetic resources. Thanks.
Daniel, did you want to add something there? Thank you. The next question is with regard to MPAs. The treaty says the COP may take decisions on measures compatible with those adopted by other instruments and frameworks. Can you talk a little about what was envisaged here and what might be possible within this realm? Nicola?
Happy to. And I also, if I may, there was another question that we moved to the answer section that we didn't actually answer yet. So I may answer both of those at once if that's okay. So I'll start with the question from Trevor who asked very early on, and so early we moved it to the answered question. So he asked if we could talk a little bit more about the protected part of marine protected areas, how it will work in practice, how the rules will be enforced, and what are the consequences for rule breakers. So to say the protected part, right, what it means to protect, that's where the management plan and the associated measures are going to come in, right? So as part of the MPA proposal, it will spell out what measures need to be taken in order to really give that protected part of the MPA effect. Now, some of those measures will be adopted directly by the BBNJ Conference of Parties and will be binding on the BBNJ Conference of Parties. There are other measures that it may be more appropriate for example, a regional fisheries management organization to adopt. And so in those instances, the BBNJ COP would actually recommend those measures to the RFMO. And also BBNJ parties who are also a party to that RFMO would have an obligation to try and advance those measures within the RFMO. So there's a couple of sort of mechanism and tools we have there. In terms of enforcement, I think we can look to a lot of lessons learned from the international fisheries enforcement sector, right? So looking to satellite monitoring, which has been a really powerful tool in enforcing and trying to track and mitigate illegal fishing, IUU fishing. So I think we can use a lot of those same tools from satellite, from AIS data, from VMS data as applicable to try and help with this, as well as other sort of fisheries legal tools in place, like the Port State Measures Agreement. I think we could potentially use that as another tool to help with monitoring and compliance. And then just to note, you know, as Duncan already mentioned, there's an implementation and compliance committee, which is meant to help sort of facilitate the effective implementation of the agreement. So we certainly would see that as being another venue to help ensure that MPAs are truly and effectively protected. Now going back to Jonathan Kelsey's question about this may take decisions on measures that are compatible with those adopted. Whew. So if anybody was a real nerd and was following the back and forth of like the treaty text language, this actually changed a couple of times and it was actually quite a hard fought provision to include with a number of countries who did not want to have this in the agreement. And we actually were hoping it would say something more like complementary to. We thought that was a nice, more broader phrasing. But I think what we ended with may take measures that are compatible with, right? Basically, that acknowledges that the BBNJ COP may take some measures for its own BBNJ parties that are compatible with those measures that RFMOs, for example, are taking that apply to their parties. Now, I have my own idea of what this could look like, but ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the ambition of the future BBNJ COP, right, as to exactly what those compatible measures are and how far they go, how ambitious they are. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Nicola. Next question, when is the agreement expected to be ratified? Sorry, well, it should be adopted and ratified. Rebecca, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So we don't have a date yet set for the meeting to adopt the agreement, but we expect it to be very soon. And the president suggested that it was going to be a very short meeting and, you know, rather a formality. And in terms of ratification, well, as we mentioned, it requires 60 states to ratify, and we expect and hope that that could happen. We could achieve that number within 2 years. Other international treaties have had really short ratification turnarounds, and considering the urgency with which we need this treaty to be in place and in action for these impact assessments and marine protected areas to get on the water, yeah, we think that 2 years is a really reasonable timeline.
Thank you, Beck. Do you envisage any major ratification challenges, and what are the implications if ratification is dragged out? Will it make 30 by 30 impossible to achieve? Lisa, do you want to take a punt first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So good question. The ratification process will take some time, and we don't anticipate any major challenges, but it does, as always, take time to get treaties ratified. But there's no reason that we can't begin work today on laying the groundwork for high seas MPA so that when the treaty comes into force, we're ready to go right away with some proposals for creation of high seas MPAs.
Thank you. And I think, sorry, I was just going to mention in response to the previous question, I think one of the things that, you know, it's language, but it's important, is that we need the treaty to be adopted first, which is what Beck was describing in terms of this very formal, you know, quick process whereby it, you know, it is a formality that they adopt it. Then it has to be ratified by the 60 countries, and then it can come into force. It's one of the things we've noticed is the language getting mixed up. So just for clarification.
Morella, can I add just one more on that question? So just to remind folks that we do have what's known as a high ambition coalition of countries, of 52 countries who have sort of signed up as emphasizing that they, you know, think this BBNJ agreement is really important. They committed to making sure we finish a treaty by 2023. And I think that we can lean on them also to be some of the early ratifiers, right? To sort of build on that ambition of not only getting the treaty text is one thing, but we also need to get it ratified. So I think we can look to those 52 countries as well as all of the countries who didn't sign up because it wasn't ambitious enough for them. So I think we look to them to help us get to that 60 quickly.
Thank you. So this is one for Daniel. Financing percentages have been established for each country. Can you detail this, and do you have any more information about it?
Of course, thank you. So any treaty like this has institutions. So we've already talked about some of the committees that will be established, and they come with a cost. And it's established in the treaty that those costs will be covered by assessed contributions. And the UN has a scale for what each country needs to pay. It's a scale of assessed contributions, and that sets, let's say, the basic financial contributions of parties to the treaty. Now, as we talked about in the MGR part, there's an additional funding stream for benefit sharing from marine genetic resources that is paid by developed countries for now, until the COP decides otherwise. And that is 50% of the assessed contribution. So in addition to the assessed contribution countries are already paying to maintain the institutions of the treaty, there will be an additional 50% paid as benefit sharing to support capacity building and implementation support to developing countries. So the 50% is the percentage that's currently in the treaty. And as I outlined earlier, the COP has a mandate to decide on a different way of calculating benefit sharing and calculating those payments in the future. But between the entry into force and the COP decides otherwise, it's 50%.
Thank you. Does the treaty address emergency or interim measures, Nicola?
Yes. So yes, I think that was a really exciting provision that was added. It was actually championed by New Zealand, and that ended up in the final text. So it enables the BBNJ COP to act and to adopt measures to address either human-caused or natural emergencies. I mean, I will add a caveat that maybe two caveats. One, the exact modalities for how that will work and the timing, because recognition that it has to act quickly. is still to be developed. That's one of the things that the BBNJ COP has to develop at its first meeting. And two, to say, it does require that the BBNJ sort of consult other bodies to make sure none of them are better able to address that emergency situation in a timely manner. But I think that's fine and good, right? Because even if you have another body that's addressing it, I think the threat that the BBNJ agreement might act if they can't in a timely manner, I think is really helpful to provide incentive to motivate a body, maybe the BBNJ body, maybe another one, to act swiftly in cases of emergencies.
Thank you. In regards to the private sector, what won't be allowed anymore? Could you give specific examples? I'll kick that to Lisa.
So thanks for the question. And just to go back to the previous questions for one moment about emergency measures, there are also provisions in the treaty for when an activity has an unanticipated effect, either in nature or extent. There is a process that allows the international community to play a role in how that emergency is managed. So there's another piece of it outside of protected areas in Article 41 of the agreement. With respect to the private sector, the question was, what won't be allowed anymore? There is no sort of broad prohibition on any existing activity. Instead, the treaty establishes assessment and management requirements that will, over time, strengthen how we manage activities in ABNJ so that they prevent significant adverse effects. And this is critically important because, as we know, the ocean is suffering under an increasing burden of overfishing, pollution of all kinds, noise pollution, chemical pollution, plastic pollution, etc. And so strengthening the management of these kinds of activities is very important. And that will, over time, I think, happen certainly with existing activities, and for new activities, the assessment and management provisions of the new treaty will really help keep new proposals that are, or make sure that new proposals for geoengineering and other activities are thoroughly assessed and are managed in a way that prevents significant adverse impacts.
Thanks, Lisa. Will the High Seas Alliance or other NGOs be able to propose High Seas MPAs to the Conference of the Parties? Nicola?
So civil society, so only states parties will be able to formally propose an MPA to the agreement. That being said, literally the paragraph right below that says states parties are the ones to propose the agreement, there's actually an obligation for states parties to collaborate and consult with a variety of stakeholders in the development of that proposal. And civil society is specifically spelled out as one of those partners that states should collaborate and consult with in the development of those proposals. So while we won't be the one to sort of formally be presenting it and proposing it to the BBNJ agreement, there's definitely a clear role for us to be involved in the process of developing that proposal.
Thank you. How will the BBNJ treaty interact with other UN organizations like the IMO, I assume the ISA as well? Lisa?
Yeah, so this is a great question. As we've been saying a number of times, the new Conference of the Parties established under the treaty cannot tell an existing body like IMO or the RFMOs or the ISA what to do. But by establishing these global norms, new global norms of impact assessment and management, over time, we anticipate that these organizations, because their parties are, the parties to them will largely be similar to the parties to the new agreement, will gradually adopt these standards as modern standards. So over time, we think that despite there is, as Duncan mentioned, a carve out for existing activities to undergo assessment and management requirements in the treaty, these organizations will be under pressure to adopt the modern assessment and management requirements in the agreement.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions that were sent in advance for journalists who were unable to join. The first is, how will the new treaty be reflected in the ISA meeting, or in, I suppose perhaps the question should be reflected in the ISA meeting coming up this month? Duncan?
Yeah, obviously we answered this before, but I think just to expand on it a little bit, there are two really important points, three actually. One, the ISA actually tried to get a carve out for, well, at least a provision setting the what's called the 1994 agreement above the BBNJ agreement, and that wasn't agreed by the parties. So that's quite important. And as I said earlier on, this agreement provides for, the BBNJ agreement provides for a body which has competence over marine biodiversity, and obviously marine biodiversity is incredibly important to what's happening in the ISA. So firstly, I think the ISA parties, as I said before, that are also parties to the BBNJ agreement, are obliged to take steps within the ISA to really harmonise the activities of the ISA with the BBNJ agreement. But then specifically, like right now, we are in the ISA. The ISA is developing exploitation regulations as opposed to exploration regulations. And in many places, they're quite inconsistent with what the BBNJ agreement has come up with. So it is really a no-brainer, quite frankly, that the ISA should, and I would argue really is obliged to, from the point of view of the participants in BBNJ also being participants in the ISA, that they should implement both the structure, the procedures, and things like consultation, transparency. We've seen real problems in the ISA with EIAs that have been conducted recently, where documents weren't put on any public website, the consultation broke down in the middle of the procedure and so on, and was heavily criticised within the ISA. So now we have an authoritative template of the BBNJ provisions. Even if they're not legally binding, they're something the ISA party should look to. And at the same time, the BBNJ is going to develop really detailed practices and procedures on, for example, protected areas. Well, the ISA has what they call the APIs, special protected areas, but they only cover the seabed, for one thing, and the scientific basis for all of them has been highly debated. So even in developing these APIs and other protected areas, they should be looking to the BBNJ agreement. So those are two specific examples, but there will be a lot of other examples where I think the BBNJ agreement will have a really important role to play. I mean, one last thing I would say is, for example, under current proposals, there would be a massive sediment plume discharged from seabed mining vessels into about 1,200 meters of water. Now that could only have massive implications for marine biodiversity in the high seas. And so you could expect the BBNJ parties to be very concerned and show real concern if that was to eventuate. In other words, if seabed mining as it's currently proposed was to start. Thanks.
Thank you, Duncan. I've got one more here, which is, how will the new treaty help with the non or underperformance of RFMOs? Anyone want to take that one? Lisa? I've got Lisa and Daniel, so let's go Lisa first, then Daniel. Thank you.
So it's a great question, and again, the treaty doesn't tell the RFMOs what to do, but it does establish these requirements for assessing and managing activities that will, over time, we believe, really help improve the practices of RFMOs, which are all over the map right now. Some RFMOs have some EIA requirements, but others have very, very weak ones. And so there are, I think, as we move ahead and as these norms become sort of common practice, and as parties to the RFMOs, which are also parties to the BBNJ agreement, begin to look at implementation of this, I think the standards and practices of RFMOs will be elevated significantly over time.
Thanks, Lisa. Daniel, did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to quickly add what was already mentioned for other bodies, that parties under the agreement have an obligation to promote the objectives of this agreement when participating in decision making under other bodies. We have seen examples in other fora where, for example, CITES or CMS, where let's say there was some overlap of mandates in terms of things that have an impact on species that are also managed under regional fisheries management organizations, that over time, just the fact that the parties are the same and that there are obligations to consult, that the practices become more equal and that there is a chance to have a positive impact through implementation.
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. Based on all the questions that we've had, was there anything any of the panelists wanted to add or just leave our guests with? Rebecca.
Oh, if Duncan wants to go first, I was just going to give a little wrap up at the end.
I'll take Duncan and then thank you.
Before the wrap up, I just thought it may be useful to give one current example of steps that can be taken towards MPAs in the high seas, and that's the Nazca Ridge and Sally y Gomez Ridge area, which goes from the east of South America, Chile, Peru, out into the high seas, and it's widely regarded as being a very, very strong contender for being an MPA, as having very high biodiversity. But what we've seen recently is, number one, some illegal fishing being undertaken in that area. But number two, on the positive side, we've seen that Chile, for example, has taken a lead to get working with working with some NGOs to undertake research in the Nazca Ridge area, and then this comes under the competence of the of the South Pacific RFMO, or Regional Fisheries Management Organization. And already, Chile has brought this intention to develop an MPA to the attention of the South Pacific RFMO body. And then the next step will be, for example, it will report to the scientific committee and then move towards the conference of the parties or the commission later on to try to implement an MPA. Once the BBNJ agreement comes into force, you would expect that, for example, to be high on the list of MPAs to be designated by the BBNJ body. And that BBNJ body could also take further steps to ensure coordination with other bodies such as the IATTC on swordfish and so on. So that's just a really specific real-time example, something that actually is happening right now in the international arena and will feed in, I think, very quickly, I would expect, to the BBNJ framework. Thanks.
Thank you, Duncan. I'm going to hand over to Rebecca.
Thanks, Marilla. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I think I guess to wrap up, this has been an incredibly huge couple of weeks for the ocean and for humanity, really, at this stage. This treaty text is something that people have been working towards for a couple of decades. And of course, it's complicated and it's detailed and it's going to take time to put into action. But I think the fact that we have such huge willingness politically to get to this point, even considering the challenges, is incredibly exciting. And the High Seas Alliance is going to be working even harder than before, if that's possible, I don't know, but to get this treaty text adopted and ratified and into force in the next couple of years. And we'll have more briefings, as Marilla mentioned, newsletter and events going forward as we keep this ball rolling and work to get the treaty active and protecting biodiversity on the high seas. So we look forward to speaking to you again very soon. And thank you again to all of the amazing Alliance members who have brought us to this stage.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you to all the panelists and everyone who joins us online. We will do a sign up, so anybody who wants to get hold of the newsletter can do, and stay in touch. Thank you.